Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Katrina Kessler, and I'm the Assistant Commissioner of Water Policy and Agriculture for the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, and I lead the Resilience and Adaptation Action Team under Governor Walz's Climate Subcabinet. I'm grateful that you have chosen to join us virtually on Earth Day to explore how extreme weather is impacting our local communities and to share how Minnesotans are preparing for these major weather events. The panelists with me this evening represent municipalities, tribal nations, and local governments, and I'm excited to talk with them about the needs and opportunities to help communities across Minnesota build resilience by prepping and adapting to climate change. Climate change is happening here and now. As you know, Minnesota is warmer and wetter than it used to be. We're experiencing more extreme precipitation events. Some people call these mega rains. The last 10 years were Minnesota's wettest on records. And these mega rain type events happen 4 more times likely than they did in the last 25 years. Extreme storms are a risk to public safety and public health. They damage homes, businesses, and infrastructure. They disrupt the lives of residents and can be devastating for Minnesota's farmers. They also cost money. 3 megastorms in 1998 resulted in $1.5 billion in loss, more than previous 40 years combined. And since that time, there have been 26 extreme weather events, each resulting in losses of $1 million or more. Extreme weather not only includes mega rains, but tornadoes, high winds, and hail. In 2010, Minnesotans had 144 tornado touchdowns, more than any other state that year. And 1 year later, southwestern Minnesota experienced 90-mile-an-hour winds, the equivalent of a Category 2 hurricane. And in 2017, 1 hour hailstorm in the greater metro area of Minneapolis resulted in $3.2 billion in losses. Minnesota's communities are increasingly underprepared for these challenges. Stormwater systems, sewer systems, and wastewater treatment plants are aging and becoming inadequate. Some of Minnesota's oldest cities have systems that date back to the late 1880s. This infrastructure is no match for extreme weather, the weather we're seeing today. And we know that on average, intense rain events overwhelm wastewater treatment plants more than 150 times annually. Across the state, this occurs, and it results in discharges of partially treated or untreated wastewater to surface waters. Many cities, counties, and tribal nations are already developing strategies to better deal with extreme weather. So this is the bright side. We know that more resources are needed to help ensure that these communities and every community can do what is needed to prepare for and adapt to climate change. We can help Minnesotans do this work by providing grants and technical assistance. And we know that every dollar spent for resilience infrastructure results in $6 of benefit by avoiding damage. Resilient funding responds to the major barrier that we've heard from communities when we've asked what they need from the state. One of the proposals we're going to talk tonight, we'll go into more detail. But at this point, I'd just like to introduce the moderator and to thank our panelists, and our moderator, Dr. Heidi Roop, an assistant professor and extension specialist at the University of Minnesota Department of Soil, Water, and Climate, will introduce the rest of our panelists now. Heidi?
Thank you so much, Katrina. And thank you all for joining us this evening on the 51st Earth Day. We were commenting earlier about how lovely it is outside. So thank you for joining us for what I hope will be both an inspiring and thought-provoking conversation. So tonight we're talking about how we can work together to prepare our communities for the impacts of extreme weather and a changing climate. We have a stellar lineup of leaders and innovators with us who are going to share about efforts underway, ideas and plans they have for how we can accelerate the collaborations, the investments, the education, engagement, and capacity building efforts that we know we need and that are required to build a strong, resilient, and climate-ready Minnesota. Our panelists this evening include Cheryl Hills, Katrina Kessler, Sarah Smith, Wendy Turry, and David Weinberg. Thank you all so much for joining us. Before we jump into questions, I'm going to give you a bit of background about the stellar lineup here. So bear with me while I read the bios, and then we'll dig into some meaty questions. So joining us tonight is Cheryl Hills, who is the Executive Director of the Region 5 Development Commission, headquartered in Staples, Minnesota. Region 5 is a 2020 recipient of an MPCA Environmental Assistant Grant to help 2 communities, Hackensack and Staples, achieve their goals and to become more resilient. Cheryl brings more than 25 years of experience in community and economic development to this work, and I'm really looking forward to her insights this evening. Katrina Kessler was appointed the Assistant Commissioner for Water Policy and Agriculture at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency in April of 2019. Previously, she was the Director of the Surface Water and Sewers Division for the City of Minneapolis, where she led management of the city's 150-year-old water infrastructure, along with work to meet both climate and water quality goals. Today, Katrina also serves as the chair of the Resilience and Adaptation Action Team under Governor Walz's Climate Change Subcabinet. Sarah Smith is the Midwest Tribal Resilience Liaison for the College of the Menominee Nations Sustainable Development Institute, where she works to facilitate strong relationships between tribes, climate researchers, and organizations. Sarah also works directly with tribes to build capacity, identify needs, and assist with their climate resilience efforts. Wendy Turry is the Director of Public Works for the City of Rochester. Wendy has over 30 years of experience related to wastewater treatment and protecting water quality in Minnesota for both local municipalities and state government. And last but not least, we have David Wamberg with us here, who is a city planner in Faribault, Minnesota, and has been working there for the last 8 years. Prior to this role, David has worked as an architect and a landscape architect for 20 years. He also serves as an adjunct professor in sustainability at the University of Minnesota. And tonight in our new format, I have a series of questions, but we of course want to hear from you, our audience members. So please send us your questions through Twitter at MNPCA. You can send those either as a public tweet or as a direct message. All right, we're ready to dig in. Wendy, we're going to start with you. So as Katrina mentioned, we're experiencing wet conditions, and Minnesota was the wettest we've ever observed during the around the decade of the 2010s, with many local and statewide records being set during that time. As one example, on June 28, 2019, Rochester experienced a heavy rainfall event from intense summertime thunderstorms. This heavy rain led to severe flooding in parts of Olmsted and Dodge counties, where numerous roads were submerged and runways were flooded at the Rochester International Airport, among a host of other impacts. How did Rochester respond to the storm, and what has it signaled for what the city needs to do to prepare for similar storms in the future?
First off, thank you, Heidi and Katrina, for inviting me. Okay, a little bit about Rochester. 6 streams come into Rochester. It's kind of in a bowl. We're very susceptible to rain events and, kind of flash flooding. But we had, because of, long in the 70s, there was a huge flood in Rochester. We were lucky enough to get a flood control system with 7 reservoirs that are all around the city to really help protect us. And honestly, it's been there. It's been here for over 30 years, and it's really done a great job. And it was designed to protect at a greater than 200-year flood event. So the rain that came on the 28th, 3 days prior, we kept getting like 1-inch rains and 1-inch rains and 1-inch rains. So everything was saturated. So if you're going to get another rain, it's going to start running off, and all our basins were becoming full. So that was sort of set the stage. And then we got these rains, and they were heavy. Those were I always look, those big drops, right? And you could hear it coming, and it was 6. I mean, they say some places they say 8 inches. Our records show greater than 6. The uniqueness about it is it was really in the southwest part of the city and then northwest part of the city. And funny little story, that day of all days, I was supposed to bring somebody to the airport in Rochester. So I was heading down the hill at 3 a.m. and I look, and what do I see? A giant tree going right by me, a huge tree on a road I never would even dream of flooding, right? And I quickly back up and, go back home, couldn't get out. But so it started raining, and it was bad. We got our emergency operations in place. We had a memory care facility that was very vulnerable of being flooded within, inches of being flooded. One of our reservoirs was within 6 inches of going over the spillway, which could mean that it could flood homes. There's still some time, but it's never even gotten close to that. None of our other ones. So we, got our emergency response system set up, and people were out monitoring everything. There were, greater than 30 homes flooded. Our stream banks were over their edges all over. Roads were flooded. Businesses were flooded. It was not a good situation at all for the city of Rochester. Ended up, just for city infrastructure, city infrastructure was over almost $1 million worth of repairs. And, one of the bigger ones was a sewer line because of just really big erosion in a waterway, almost completely exposed that sewer line. And then it resulted in us doing, and I think we're continuing now to do work that is fixing up the results of that. So what did the city do? I think we'd already realized we needed to start doing something. We knew we had, these big heavy rain events. And one thing we already had in place is we'd been doing a sewer, sanitary sewer master plan. So we were looking at the wastewater, and there we really designed determining whether or not our system was full at 25-year rain event. And so that it limits the capacity, the usage, but it did help us. We did not have any sewer bypasses as a result of that. So a good thing. Stormwater, we haven't done as much, but we do have a surface water management plan that's in the works. It's been approved, and we're working on that right now. And that's really about resiliency, sustainability, and water quality. So we're working that. And then there's also a sustainability resilience task force, which is 2 of their 5 goals is around climate change and environmental health. So there's some planning going on, which is good. In the meantime, we're doing, different things. We're spending about $100,000 a year just to do stream bank restoration. We have $2 to $3 million projects on just stormwater projects. Our city infrastructure projects, we're always trying to do some sort of green infrastructure like tree trenches, those kinds of things. We're, looking at our codes to see where we're going to change things. We're really going to let those 2 plans drive where we change things. We've also looked at the Atlas 14, the new rain numbers, and compare that, the flood areas with the new flood areas. And so when we get development in, we really just look at it and say, wait, this could be a risk area, and make determinations. We're trying to keep green space in place. So I think we're working on a bunch of different things. They're scattered, expensive. I think you're going to hear that from all of us. These 2 different plans that are in play right now, I think, are going to be what ties them all together. And then we'll have to figure out, how do we pay for it, and how are people ready? Because it changes how you develop as well.
Thank you. I think it's, it's so easy to say, oh, there's this rain event or this mega storm or this thing. And then when you look under the hood, right, it's so much more complicated. And so I think it's easy for us to sort of dismiss the real community-based impact, right? It was infrastructure and homes and water quality and wastewater. And so it's really systems that are touched by these singular events, or in this case, a sort of combination of events. And of course, responding, as you said, requires sort of resources and coordination and planning and real engagement with the community. So in that spirit, David, I'm curious, when we look at smaller communities in Minnesota, when we think about staffing and capacity and resources, maybe not being the equivalent of some of these larger cities and jurisdictions, how are you planning and working to prepare for these events and for the things that might be worsened by climate change? And if you could share with us maybe some resources that you've discovered that you found particularly useful that others might learn from or use in their work as well.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. And I'm really excited to hear from others during this whole forum and any questions and comments you might have. So without a doubt, I would say that a small community does have staffing challenges and resource challenges, but every community, whether they're large or small, are going to be dealing with those same issues. And we all have an important role to play, whether, again, we're in a small community or a large community. Just because Faribault is a small community, we can't say that we don't have staff to deal with it, so we're not going to do anything. We can't expect weather to go around us just because, you know, we're a small community and we don't have staff to deal with it. So we all need to do our part on this. So what I'd like to do, though, I don't want to minimize how difficult it is for small communities, but at the same time, I'll share with you maybe 3 recommendations I would have for communities that are smaller and dealing with some of these issues. The first is to build a shared awareness and understanding of climate change and extreme weather amongst the staff and the elected officials and appointed officials, but also amongst the community as a whole, right? I think that's really important. And that is going to involve somebody stepping up. That probably it isn't written in their job description, but someone either on staff stepping up and saying, this is important, we've got to talk about that. But it could also be coming from a council member or a person in the public, but somebody saying, this is important, let's talk about that. And I think it's also helpful as you think about, you know, building this shared awareness and understanding of extreme weather and having that conversation, to picture it as there's different doorways into that conversation, right? And for some people, that's going to be economic. Wendy talked about the economic impact in Rochester, for example, right? In Faribault in 2010, well, and across all southern Minnesota, we had a major flood. It shut down our major industries for a week. That had a huge economic impact on our community. And that's a doorway that a number of people go in to discuss things like extreme weather. But for others, it's going to be the social component, or it's going to be the environmental component, and just being open to bringing others into that conversation. And I think, you know, the goal here is to build this broad awareness and understanding of extreme weather and climate change and what we can do about it, but just really having that conversation. And ultimately, I think what my goal is to have it embedded throughout the community. And so it's not one person, it's not one department that's in charge of this, but it's embedded in the community. And just as a quick example, so just earlier this week, the fire chief came to me and said, Dave, we're taking out some of this mowed and manicured grass at the fire station, and we're going to replace it with a prairie and pollinators. And then just a couple hours ago, the custodial staff came to me at City Hall and said, Dave, good news, we're getting rid of our gas lawnmower and we're getting an electric one later this week. And those things are great. Now you could say, well, those are really small steps in the whole picture of extreme weather and so on. But the important thing is it's showing this embedded sense of this is important. No matter what job you have or what role you have, this is really important. And there's so much more that we can do, but let's celebrate some of those things and build on it. So that's number one, is that getting that shared awareness and understanding. Second, I would say, is to create a shared and compelling vision. So have people look out like 20 years. What does Faribault look like 20 years from now with this extreme weather and these changes? So if we're looking at some of the things that we've had in devastated flooding, and we're constantly replacing our ball fields in our park and doing this, well, what's a different vision for that? That might be this green wildlife corridor space that handles things like the flooding and really gets people excited about it. One of my favorite quotes that I use often is from Saint Exupéry, the author of The Little Prince, and you might have read that, but he talks about if you want to build a ship, don't assign people these tasks and tell them do this or that, but paint this, have them yearn for the endless sea, right? And I think if you can get this shared and compelling vision, the rest of that will fall in place. But Heidi, to get to your question more specifically, and the last thing I'll say is more practically in terms of the resources, take advantage of the tremendous resources that are out there. I mean, we have been so grateful for the work and the funds and the expertise from the MPCA, from the University of Minnesota, from CERTS, CEE, all the nonprofits. I mean, the list goes on, the EPA. I mean, we have gotten so much help and support, and we don't have to be experts in it. There is so much out there, so take advantage of that. And that's really helped us here in Faribault.
Thank you so much. And I must apologize. I think I said Faribault, which obviously illuminates how new I am to Minnesota. So my apologies to you for not getting that right.
No, that's fine.
Thank you. Learn something new every day. I love that, really centering this in community and looking towards the future, right? Rather than painting the problem, painting the opportunity. And it's really hard to see opportunity amidst this challenge that is climate change. But I think really that framing is the one that can accelerate us forward. So I really, what you said really resonates with me, and that approach I think is one that I'd love to see more folks use to embed in their work. And I think this segues beautifully to Sarah and some of Sarah's work with tribal nations and intertribal entities across Minnesota and the greater Midwest. So Sarah, and Sarah's just coming off a huge effort of a multi-day shifting season summit that brought together a range of folks from across the country together to have just really inspiring conversations around tribal leadership in the space of climate change and preparing for climate and community-centered responses. And so thank you for that. I'm sure you have lots to share on the heels of that multi-day discussion, but I'd love for you to share with us, so tribes are often referred to and seen as leaders in this space, and you've been really centered in a lot of this leadership and helping to amplify this leadership out in the communities that you serve and are connected to. So can you share some of the work and some of these stories that you think are really powerful to show us how tribes are working in the space of responding across our very connected and intertwined sort of human and natural systems?
Yeah, thank you, Heidi. I really am resonating with what Dave just spoke about with involving the community and you bringing up the different components as well, because a lot of my work for the College of Menominee Nation, we have the Menominee theoretical model of sustainability. And I think about that a lot in the work I do as a liaison. And it touches on those different components, such as the natural environment, land and sovereignty, institutions, technology, economics, and then that social realm, that human perceptions and activities. So I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think that's in the back of my mind every day when I'm doing work. Especially when it comes to climate adaptation and resilience planning. And the tribes are thinking that way too, because everything is interconnected, whether we're working in the natural resources or in our separate institutions, especially with these extreme weather events, whether it's, extreme rain events or heat waves or really cold ice storms, right? And so, I work as a liaison across the Midwest, and so I can't speak for every tribe in Minnesota because there are many, but I can share, some of the things I do know about that tribes are working on, and some of the topics that they work on is really dependent on the funding sources they get. So when it comes to infrastructure, that's a really big one. In Indian country is making sure infrastructure is really sound, especially with extreme weather events, and having culverts blow out or roads wash away, and also thinking about areas where people maybe go harvest or, have some subsistence species that they usually access, and having those access points being washed out by extreme events and things like that. And so thinking about, funding sources for that. Right now, I am assisting with the with ITEP's 202 climate change course. And ITEP is the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals, and their 202 course is really focused on hazard mitigation planning. And so we have a Region 5 cohort, which includes Minnesota. And so I know Lower Sioux is working really hard with that. And as an example, they recently applied for the Bureau of Indian Affairs Tribal Climate Resilience funding this past year in the category we have for planning for relocation, managed retreat, and protect in place for coastal and ravine communities. And so things like extreme weather events are really powerful, with those being next to, rivers and large water body sources. And so Lower Sioux is dealing with a lot of erosion along the Minnesota River. And so their project in particular is looking at flooding and erosion assessments to develop mitigation strategies and try to develop these recommendations for installing erosion protections. And so that's just one way, one example of the tribes in Minnesota. Another one I'll mention as well is with the Fond du Lac Tribal College. Actually, they received money, I think it was back in 2018, to develop this Climate Strong project. So really building tribal youth leadership for climate resiliency. And it was through a NOAA grant that they received this, really specific for weather and climate hazards. And so it's really educating youth, which can range from middle school to high school, or even younger. And they're taking them on these youth camps, these 3-day youth camps, to teach the kids about community resilience, what climate change is, what they can do in their community as youth, and become leaders in that movement. Because a lot of what we do, and Dave touched on this too, is that the work we're doing is for these future generations. And what better than to teach the youth about what's going on and how to become leaders in that driving force for their 7 generations down the road. So I can talk a lot about that, but I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. And we can definitely circle back. I have a few questions I think that you could touch on there and add some more. Just for the audience chiming in, just a friendly reminder that we will transition to your questions. So please be sure to submit those to us on Twitter at MNPCA. So please, we'll be looking forward to your questions for the panelists. So Katrina, I'm gonna come to you here, since we've been talking about a range of resources, I think financial and otherwise, that are required to do this work. And so I'm just hoping you could provide us with a bit about, what is the state doing to think about the resources required, and maybe what you're already doing and what you're hoping to do, or what you're hearing from communities should be done to provide communities with the resources that they really need to help plan and prepare for extreme weather and climate change.
Well, thanks for that question, Heidi. And I just want to say thank you to Wendy and David and Sarah, because listening to them, I'm writing notes as I am listening, is exactly what I think the state should be doing. I think we need to be listening to the local voices, because to all of the speakers' points that have already been made, they are best situated at the most local level, whether that's at the Public Works or the City Planning Commission or with the tribal government, to understand their unique impacts and the solutions that might be the right ones for their challenges. So the first thing I think we need to be doing is to foster collaborative discussion and engagement, and then be active listeners. And I think the state has a prominent platform, and this is an example. We were able to invite all of you here, but we are not the right entity to lead every effort. And I think particularly when it comes to helping or assisting local partners with mitigation and adaptation, I see our role as listening, convening, advocating for resources, and then kind of passing them on to implement the local priorities. And I think this is really important for all of us, and my colleagues especially, because you heard in the beginning, I used to work in a similar role to what Wendy has now, and I heard from residents and business owners and natural resource managers at the local level about the challenges they were experiencing, whether that's from intense rain events, and they're unique. And I think it's unique at a local level, but there's some lumping and conglomeration that can happen as we bring it up, just to think about how we can fund these different groups of activities. So that's one thing that I think is really important at the state level. I'll tell you one other thing that I think we're trying to do more of, and intentionally at the state level, is just recognizing and calling out that the impacts of climate change are not equitably felt. So we need to do better to write historic disproportionate impacts, whether that's environmental justice or historic racism written into laws or statutes or programs. We need to recognize that we've been working for decades kind of in certain lanes that A, may not be well suited for climate work, and B, might historically or lead us to the same ends that we would have historically been to, and those are not where we need to be nor we want to be. So we want to make sure that as we listen and design programs to assist local partners, that we're doing it in a way that recognizes disproportionate impacts from years of underinvestment in primarily BIPOC communities. So I will just highlight two specific things that we are calling for in the governor's climate sub-cabinet adaptation team. I mentioned that that's one of the elements of my work that I lead right now. And that team, which represents interdisciplinary staff from state agencies and some local partners and tribes, came up with a handful of initial ideas to engage with others on. We talked to local business, or we talked to local partners, we talked to tribes, we talked to environmental advocates, and those ideas are being refined still, but two of them I think are most relevant to this audience. And the first is an adaptation fund, the establishment of a state grant program that could provide tribal governments, local partners, the opportunities to either start to do the planning work you heard David and Wendy and Sarah describe, or to accelerate work that is already underway. So it would be grants that would be available to do climate vulnerability assessments, to layer onto a community's asset management framework to understand where infrastructure might be vulnerable or other assets might need additional work. Thinking about habitat protection, things like easements in vulnerable areas. And we don't want to predetermine what all the criteria will be. This is an ask that is currently moving through the legislature, because we want to recognize that you heard three really cool, very different examples already of the type of work that's happening at the local level. And we don't want to predetermine that everybody needs to do a climate vulnerability assessment and develop a plan in this way. So I think we're trying to meet people where they are and to accelerate their work to make their community and their space more resilient. And so that would be coupled hopefully with increased money, whether that's state or federal dollars, for bonding to implement these types of projects. So the first grant program, the $2.9 million in the governor's budget, would be for the planning component, and hopefully we would get some bonding dollars to accelerate the implementation, or maybe this will come through the Biden administration infrastructure plan. So we're seeing opportunities at the federal level for increased investment. And so I think we at the state level and at the local level need to do our part to prepare and get ready and get competitive for when those funds become available. And the second area that I'll call out is, and you heard a mention of data and needing to understand at the local level, like where the impacts are, or what it means for any particular parcel or any particular part of the community. One of the things that I think the state is uniquely situated to do is to help collate and collect and communicate data, whether that's impacts of extreme weather or other climate events. We call this climate projections. And the University of Minnesota is doing some of this right now at a 10-kilometer scale, where at any parcel in the state at the 10-kilometer scale, you could go and look and see what climate models show would be impacts into the future. And there are calls for even expanding that to a more granular scale, perhaps a 4-kilometer scale, so that organizations could design and implement projects that will be expected to last through the century. I love Sarah's 7 generations analogy. So we're hearing that these data are needed. When you mentioned Atlas 14, this is something that could work in partnership with that and build on that. And we want to make sure that if this is a position and a role that the state should play, that we can advocate for advancing this work.
Great, thank you. As a climate scientist, I love data, but only in context. Right? It's only one small tool in our growing toolbox that's going to help us address this challenge. And so, Cheryl, of course, last but not least, regional development commissions are a new and critical partner in helping Minnesota cities prepare for extreme weather. Can you give us a sense of what Region 5 is doing to help communities understand the challenges and take advantage of sort of some of these connections between resilience and economic vitality and some of the other things around community that you've heard our panelists mention?
Yeah, thank you so much, Katrina and Heidi, for inviting me in. What a cool group of folks to hang with for a bit. Region 5 Development Commission is almost 50 years old, y'all. So we and the other regional development commissions in the state are equally as old. So there are 9 of us out here, and we do lots and lots of planning, right? Like many communities, but hazard mitigation, transportation, lots of working with the soil and water conservation districts on water plans, and economic development plans are funded by our federal government. But we do a lot of comprehensive planning also with local units of government. In our region, like you said, and David pointed out about the smaller communities that you mentioned, Heidi, and we have one community that's 10,000 in population. The rest are mostly under 2,000 people. So they do not have wonderful Davids or Wendy's on staff of, small communities. So they rely on folks like us to do the kind of planning that helps them understand where their priorities are. We took a different approach in 2020 when MPCA funded Region 5. As you indicated, Heidi, in the introduction, we were funded to work with 2 communities to start out and understand how to locally prioritize approaches and prepare for, as you said, extreme weather and climate changes. But those plans were interesting because they weren't, this is speaking to some of the things that you've all spoke about, in that the plans could be standalone plans as addendums approved by city councils to their comprehensive plans, or they are woven in as part of a comprehensive plan. This is why that cross-pollination that David was talking about and making sure that we're thinking about all of these issues across all departments of a community. A lot of times comprehensive plans will they'll do land use planning, but they don't necessarily do energy, environment, or climate planning. But we know that local unit, you do what you'll do what you plan for. And so when those local units of government are planning and putting that in a comprehensive plan, there's much more likelihood 10 years from now when they update that plan, that climate planning is going to be part of their work, just like transportation is, just like housing is, just like economic development is. So it's changing those systems and how we think about how to do that. But more importantly, what MPCA helped fund was seed dollars where communities could then start to, I call it the magic apron effect. You put the apron on, you get in the kitchen and you start cooking together, because that's how you learn how to cook. It's hard to learn how to cook with a recipe. So that's that implementation, that practice of, but the practice that we were really seeking was not just environmental benefits. It really, again, goes back to some of what David was talking about. The projects that they wanted them to fund had to have a TBL approach. They had to have some social benefit and economic benefits as well. So we looked at projects that had all of the above, none in isolation. Do no harm has always been an approach, but it certainly had to be a way that helped us prosper true sustainability through some of these projects. The public input, a lot of public input and direction. Communities also are wondering about how to take their local dollars. Now that you have a comp plan where community residents have said, this is what we want our local elected officials to do with our tax dollars, that is freedom for elected officials to be able to start to implement projects that they were maybe otherwise concerned of, frankly, in communities that don't even utter the word climate change or climate planning. So this was a way to approach addressing needs in communities that had some concerns about climate planning. So We've also leveraged a lot of federal and state investments for communities in other areas, and we expect to do the same in this area. So I love what Katrina was talking about the adaptation fund. Likewise, we work with EDA, federal EDA a lot, and we access dollars and have for many, many years. We're asking EDA and our foundation partners and our state agency partners, as part of our commitment to doing the work that we're doing funded by MPCA, to also start asking those same sorts of questions we're asking in our local communities. It doesn't mean that MPCA or other folks like the foundations who care about social justice and equity, that they have to double down in environmental, but they can be asking the questions, right? About, does your project or program have any economic impacts, social impacts, environmental impacts? And when we all start doing that, pretty soon, a lot of benefits are happening across the board. Communities do understand, Heidi, to your question about how to prosper economically through climate planning. Sometimes it's an easier conversation in some communities than it is in others, but they understand that these create jobs in conservation and energy and project and program management. They understand that they can attract a workforce who want to live in healthy communities, right? Those are easy cases to make. But the cost savings of preventative care that Katrina and Wendy talked about as well, versus that repair and recovery, that includes, by the way, cost savings of rebuilding cultural assets as well, because environment is part of our rural culture, and maintaining that culture is part of maintaining those environmental assets. And so they see that connection. So communities are not necessarily without knowledge and desire. Sometimes they're under-resourced, and that's why I love these programs that Katrina was talking about, because the resources matter. I'll end with that. I think that's enough to share for now, but thank you.
Thank you. And to our audience, please do submit any questions you might have for our panelists. We will take any questions we get in now. And while we wait for some audience feedback and questions, I sort of want to touch on and build on some things you've all said. And one of the things that I think a lot about, and I think is it's harder to talk about and maybe think about how we integrate, but I think you've all beautifully touched on the role of sort of community and community engagement. And so when I think about reducing our exposure to risks related to weather and climate and reducing our overall vulnerability, we know that we also have to increase sort of the cohesion of our communities. So the social cohesion, we need to support civic participation and community stewardship, right? These are all markers of effective community responsive resilience approaches. And so just to any panelists, I'm wondering if you have any stories or examples you can share where I know we've sort of touched on some of these, or if any of you want to build on examples where sort of investments in the community and these other, in our environment, our cultural assets, if you will, and our connection to environment, sort of these other elements that are so critical to doing this work well, how we can include that and be responsive to that as we seek resources and fit our programs and projects into RFPs, right? Sarah, I see you nodding your head, so I might open the floor to you, but how does that work when we're working on sort of a project by project basis or trying to fit our community needs into an RFP, a proposal for funds, something like that? How do you see this work, either expanding or have you seen really great examples?
Yeah, I can start. I think it really depends on the RFP itself because of, what certain RFPs allow, right? And so one of the things that I work on with a very amazing team is planning with tribes using our tribal adaptation menu. So this is a tool that we published back in 2019. So it's relatively new. It's called Debagan Jgadeg Anishinaabe Ezitwad. And I'm a novice in Ojibwe. I'm from the Oneida Nation, so Ojibwe is a newer thing for me, so I'm working on pronunciations. But when it comes to, getting the community involved, really what Cheryl said is they're interested, they want to be involved. They just need the opportunity to be involved. And so when we're doing these planning sessions, we always ask the community to come in, And these projects can lead to really great RFPs depending on the grants. We work on different projects like wild rice, or it could be an education component, like a natural resource program. And so I think, having that community input is really important. And for a lot of the tribal planning, we also consider, our culture and our perspectives. And so this tribal adaptation menu helps us bring those forward in a different way than, some RFPs might be laid out. And so that's just one way I've been trying to work with tribes and help in that manner.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to talk about this sort of idea of kind of social cohesion, civic participation, our community stewardship? Like, how do we bring these elements into the work that you've all discussed, or how are you already doing that?
This is Wendy. We're definitely recognized for the city of Rochester. This is an area particularly here. I think because we've had these flood control systems in place, and we've been a little bit buffered. That it's a big need, it's a need for us, and we have these two different planning efforts going on, and the Sustainable Resilience Task Force is doing something really, I think, good to bring help bring everybody in the city together, and it's a pretty large task force, and 25% of that task force is from the BIPOC community, and so then they set these 5 goals, and again, I said 2 of them are really related to climate change resilience, and they went back to each of their communities and the whole team, and then now are bringing back strategies based on what they heard from their communities. So and they're getting a wide variety of different strategies. So I think just that we're getting, it was a good way to kind of involve a larger part of the community. In terms of our surface water management, that one of our top goals is really engagement, hear from everybody, social equity, all of those things. Obviously we want to make sure we're managing the surface water, and we're looking at green infrastructure. But really, if we don't get the rest of it done, I think David said it so well. If we don't get people's buy-in, we're not going to get where we need it. So I think I can say we're not there yet, but we know we need to get there. So help. Some of the stuff Katrina's mentioning is really good.
Excellent. Well, we do have one question from the audience that's come in, and this is a great question, so I'm eager to hear your response. But the questions around the Yale Climate Opinion polls and maps indicate that most Minnesotans do in fact believe that climate change is happening, but in nearly every county, less than 40% believe it will affect them personally. So the question is, how do we create a strong association between these extreme events, these sort of lived events, and climate change? Does anyone want to tackle that question?
It sort of relates to the question around how do you get people engaged, and I think that it does anyway, and how do we help them see them in this space and in this issue? And it is about value propositions around what people care about. So when we're talking to people who have a historic connection to, the economic conversation, we lead with that. So it's the value proposition of where they're starting from, health and wellness of people for hospitals that we want to bring into the conversation. We're also very thoughtful about making sure that as we're having those conversations, so people can see themselves in this dialogue, that we communicate in ways that they're comfortable with. So we hire interpreters for the non-English speaking or our Anishinaabe neighbors up at Leech Lake Band. We make sure that we're using language that allows particularly limited English speaking people to fully participate in the conversation that is deep and sometimes layered with some data in a language that will help them connect to their themselves, right, as people. And so recognizing language, speaking to people from where they're coming from in terms of their value propositions, all of those things are really important around cultural identity, what that culture is. Is it a veteran culture? What kind of culture is it? Is it a farming culture? And then speaking to them from that aspect is how people see themselves. And then they understand, oh, this is my yard. This is me. This is what I'm doing in my house, that it does matter, right? Because otherwise it's somebody else. It's always some other community or some other nation until it's not. And the only way to get to that is the value proposition.
Can I just add to what Cheryl said, because I think that's spot on. And one of the things that we've been looking at with our data that we collect on biology and chemistry and water quality are potential changes in fish populations that can occur and are projected to occur if we have changes in the temperature of the water. And you think about where we have cold water fisheries. It's not in Minneapolis and St. Paul, so it's in greater Minnesota. And how often someone's association with the land and their identity is one and the same with hunting or fishing, and impacts to wildlife ecosystems habitat that you need for waterfowl that you may want, or food that is provided for the animals that you're interested in. Those are all things that are impacted by climate change. So to Cheryl's point, you definitely thinking about the interests of your audience and coming prepared to speak to that is critical. And I think we do have a lot of information at our fingertips that we should be using in those conversations. And even the title of this event tonight, extreme weather. Like, yes, climate change causes extreme weather. You could just say impacts of climate change, but some people are more comfortable talking about extreme weather. I mean, Minnesotans also like to talk about weather. So almost anybody will engage in a conversation with you about weather. And so that may be an inroads that you can start. So I think it's kind of just doing a little homework in advance to think about where their interests lie, to Cheryl's point, and then just, dipping your feet in the water and just starting, because it's on all of us. And I think you've heard from David and Wendy, they're trying at the local level to engage their residents. And when we are successful, we win really big, because you get buy-in from individuals and neighborhoods and municipalities and regions, and that's when the change occurs.
Great. And David, it looks like you have been nodding and maybe want to chime in. Do you have anything you'd like to add on the heels of engaging and communicating these sort of conversations, or did I misread your?
No, well, I'm absolutely enjoying hearing everything that everyone says, and I'm nodding in confirmation that yes, I think this is right on. I would say I would build on the idea of the connections between everything within the community, but also between the community and the larger region, and then you go to globally on how all of this begins to tie together. So if you're into systems thinking, you begin to just see how you can't just change one little part without beginning to affect everything else on this. So it's really important. And if you sit in a house that you go, well, I'm outside the floodplain, or I've got central air, I don't have to worry about the heat, but you're affected by all of these things, and everyone is affected by those who don't have those same situations that you do. And just getting that conversation about the importance of these connections, I think, is really important.
Thank you. And we'll maybe answer this one quickly, and then I have a closeout question for you all, but we do have one more audience question. And Katrina, I think you touched on this a bit, but the question is anyone working on changing biodiversity and/or species changes as they plan for the future? I don't know if anyone wants to tackle that.
Well, I will just expand briefly that the MPCA, in coordination and partnership with the DNR, are collecting data on this. And certainly within the purview of the Resilience and Adaptation Action Team that we're working on under the climate subcabinet that the governor established, we're working in partnership with the sister group, which is called Natural and Working Lands, which is thinking about forests and biodiversity. Not only what are the impacts, but what are likely changes that we're going to see. And we have models that are built on the data that we're collecting that can help us and help our partners think about how to make decisions that will, impact a land parcel or a stretch of stream, such that we can maintain the biodiversity or mitigate the change as much as possible. So that work is happening. I think one thing that I know that we need to do better is to communicate this work, because I do think a lot of people care about this. Whether it's their flora and fauna or the birds that depend on the habitat. I think we can do better on sharing these stories and sharing the availability of this information so that others can connect to it and connect their community to it. So that's on our list of things to do as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, so Cheryl, you said something that's really resonated for me, and I like good analogies. So roll with me here. It's one I didn't workshop before. So you said, you got to put the apron on and get in the kitchen because you can't just use a recipe to learn how to cook, right? So when I think about this topic of resiliency and addressing extreme weather and climate and sort of all the myriad of approaches and types of communities you represent and organizations with whom you partner, so if we're creating this sort of cookbook, right, we know there's no one size fits all. We have our own flavors and we need to make our own sort of pinch of this and pinch of that, right, because we can't have a rule book. That's not how this work works. So I'm going to just ask you to roll with me on this analogy. And if we're thinking about this cookbook and the ingredients that we need to bring to the table, from your perspective, what is either the ingredient that we already have that we need to amplify or use more of in this, as we design this cookbook for our resilient future, or, so what's the ingredient that you're going to bring to the table from your community or in your work to help us to design and craft these solutions and this work moving forward? So if we're going to create our Minnesota climate resilience cookbook, what's one key ingredient or maybe tool you think we need in order to at least work towards getting this right? And we'll just go around the room. Cheryl, you'll start.
I dig how you do that. That's really good, Heidi. Thank you. A couple really quick things. One, match. Match is not easy for some communities, particularly those that have been economically depressed and or have a lot of social issues as well. So low income communities the match is a challenge. And so that's an area that we've been really working on as part of that recipe to try to help communities find that match. Two, I love what Katrina said. You stole it, girl, right out from under me, is storytelling. It is storytelling. And I think that is an opportunity of which we need to really capitalize on more, because people want to be part of a winning team and a winning story. And they want to think that what they're doing really is on the right direction. And it's great to get affirmation. So more storytelling around even the smallest of projects, to help people see, oh, I can do that, right? I can do that. I think storytelling is important, but I think another thing when we give this data, the piece of the recipe that might be, that I'd love to figure out how to find that spice, is the value propositions around two different sectors, two different communities, two different folks, so that value, whether it's hunters and fishermen or farmers or, right, resort owners, whoever it is, the value propositions is hard to find in the data, right? It's there, but it's not layman terms. And so value propositions that are easily captured as part of that storytelling. And then lastly, I will share with you as part of the storytelling, I think it's also equally important to figure out where we messed up. Because you know what? I don't want to make that dang dish if it tasted like crap. I want to make a dish that tastes good. So let's learn how you didn't do what you're supposed to do and stirred wrong or whatever, whipped the eggs too much. And let's figure out, so I don't do that. Let me make my own mistakes. But sharing where the recipe got messy and the sausage got ugly, we got to share that, right? And that takes courage of folks to be able to do that, because the last thing we want to do is tell our funders where we messed up out of fear of not being funded again. And that's just reality. But if state agencies and foundations and other folks are saying, federal agencies are saying, share that too, so that we can really change systems collectively to what the team is talking about. Those are the pieces of the recipe that I'm super excited to taste.
Great, thank you. All right, and for the rest of us, we'll go around. You get one ingredient because Cheryl's already helped us to create the framework. No, that we've got a good framework. So Sarah, one more ingredient you'd add as we move forward.
Yeah, it's hard to narrow down to one ingredient. I'd say the one I would bring is a paradigm shift on how we view the world and the beings around us when we're tackling climate change. Especially, I know we didn't get to touch on invasive species, but that's one that gets brought up a lot because they're non-local beings. And so having that paradigm shift on how we view the world and bringing that culture is really important, because tribes have their cultures, Minnesotans have their culture too, right? We have those who ice fish, hunt, like Cheryl was saying. We have this rich culture, and we need to start shifting our paradigm on how we view the lands that we live on and work on, and how to go forward.
Thank you. And Wendy, your ingredient.
All right, I think we need, in order for us to make this happen, we need to bring in all different parts of the community. We need to find those leaders from within, right, that help push it up. And then we need to figure out how to help give them resources. So I think it's the combination, because if people aren't ready to do it, it's not going to happen. So I feel like if we get local leaders from all over, different parts, different things they like, then I think we'll be able to move it forward. But it's going to take a lot of people.
I think that's great, right? We got to build the appetite before we cook. And David, how about your ingredient?
So let me say, first of all, I love the talk about storytelling. And I will say one thing before I give you my one ingredient. So, listening to people tell stories, I think is so important. I remember I was at a conference once in Wisconsin. And when I got into this work a long time ago, I was reading Alda Leopold in Sand County, Aldermac, that I just went, oh, this is great stuff. And the keynote speaker at this conference I was at many years later was a daughter of Alda Leopold. And she talked about climate change and how this, growing up and at the shack and all those kinds of things. And we weren't that far from the shack. And I signed up for a bus thing that went out to the shack. And then she went through the shack with us where Alda Leopold was. And she talked about these things, just how the birds have changed and how the landscape and the trees and all those kinds of things. And it just made such a huge impact on me. And same thing with Will Steger's stories with my kids and the polar bears. Those storytelling is really important. But for the sake of giving you a different ingredient, I will tell you this, and this just for the sake of coming up with something different. So much of what gets discussed is a lot of yes, but. Yes, but, yeah, there's climate change, but humans really can't do anything about it. Or yes, but we don't have the money to do it. Yes, but you're really not making that big of a difference. And I think changing the conversation to yes and, so yes, and so you put some native landscaping and you put a rain garden in, that's great. And, and build on it, but don't go into the but and turn it into a negative kind of thing. Just keep moving forward with yes and. So that would be just for the sake of a different ingredient that I would add into it.
That's great. Yes, and I would have dessert, please. And with that, Katrina, I'll pass it to you for your ingredient and maybe closing out our conversation today. I wish we could I now want to workshop with you all an actual creation of a climate resilience and extreme weather cookbook of all our ingredients so we can, splash our pasta sauce on it and make it better and, pass it down to generations. So Katrina,
right.
Over to you.
Well, I also am very hungry now. So it's good we're coming to the end. And I don't know that I can top what's already been said, but I think from my perspective, where I see the most opportunity is to listen with empathy and then really actively try to find connections across areas where we have divides and then build collaboratively from there. And I think that's what we need to do to be better at this. And then I will just say thank you especially to Heidi and to Wendy and Dave and Sarah and Cheryl. This was really fun. And on behalf of the MPCA and the governor's subcabinet, I appreciate you spending your Earth Day with us. And I learned a lot. And I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. So thank you and have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Before we conclude the live stream, I just want to hop on here. This is Mary Robinson from the MPCA, just to share the next event in the forum series is coming up on May 13th. The topic for our conversation will be soil health and carbon storage. We hope you can join us for another great discussion. If you want to learn more about what the state of Minnesota is doing about climate change, you can visit mn.gov/climate. And while you're there, you can sign up for our emails so you'll automatically receive updates about upcoming events like this conversation here tonight. Happy Earth Day and thanks again for joining us.